All right, so Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the man in the top hat I've called this. And the reason I've called it that is because you remember the London Olympics. Cast your minds back to 2012. Remember that fabulous opening at the Olympics where they did a potted history of Britain, starting way, way back Stonehenge, and then the Industrial Revolution came and these massive chimneys appeared up out of the arena. And in the middle of it, on a grassy mound, there was this chap here with a top hat. The American newspapers wrote that Kenneth Branagh, top left, starred as Abraham Lincoln at the London Olympics opening ceremonies. Twitter apparently was in a meltdown, going, why is Abraham Lincoln at the London Olympics? And of course, it wasn't Abraham Lincoln. Kenneth Branagh was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Beautiful. This is an exact copy. We'll see a photo later on of Brunel, and they've meticulously reproduced his costume. Look at the buttons on his trousers, the fob chain on his watch, and the top hat. So when we get to his photo, have a note, you'll notice those amazing buttons and things there. This would be about an 1854, I think, photo. Who is he? Oh, there he is. There's the photo. Can you see the buttons down the bottom? Hands in the pockets, which we're told at Sovereign Hill gentlemen never did. And the fob chain, always smoking. Died quite young, you'll see there. Died quite young. Probably the smoking didn't really help. Right, and who was he? Well, got his name from his father, a Frenchman whose name was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The kingdom came from his mother, was her maiden name. So his father is Mark Brunel, and Mark is Isambard Mark Brunel, but he was known as Mark. So he got his father's first name, French. His mother's maiden name was Kingdom. So that's where the rather unusual name came from. Right. And his father was an engineer, very, very famous engineer who Brunel went to work for. Now, the father, Mark Brunel, comes to fame. His great claim to fame is that he managed to build a tunnel under the Thames. It was a pedestrian tunnel, and the soil under the Thames is sticky. It's sticky clay. It won't hold its shape. People had tried to create a tunnel, but they couldn't because it wouldn't hold up. And Mark Brunel invented this amazing machine which had all these panels and it moved forward. It had 3 different levels, you can see there. The men were shielded. So they're basically in this massive iron cage. They're digging, so to the left of this screen, they're digging forward and behind them come bricklayers. This machine is still the model that they're using in the tunnelling machines in Melbourne, building the new underground. It's still the same principle. You dig a hole forward and behind you, behind the grinders, they're now doing concrete, of course, they bricked it. So this turned out, it was sort of a success. There were a lot of problems with building it. It did actually collapse a couple of times. It flooded a couple of times. There were some tragic losses of life. Brunel nearly drowned himself while he was supervising one day, but eventually it did open. A lot of people were sceptical about using this tunnel. So what they did, the Brunels, was they hosted a lavish luncheon in the tunnel to celebrate its opening. Now, this tunnel was so well built that it is actually still there. It's no longer a pedestrian tunnel. It's now out of the railway. This is showing you people walking through. The tunnel turned out to be not a great success because the idea was that you were going to pay a penny to walk through this tunnel. But by the time it was opened, you could actually get across the Thames. It was cheaper to go across the bridges. So it never made any money. It was, here, I'll show you this one first. get into the tunnel. So you walked in the top, down these steps. Can you see the arches down the bottom? This plaque is still there. If you go today, you can see this plaque commemorating Isambard, the father, making this walk with the tunnels down the bottom. This is what it looks like today. This was a couple of years ago. The tunnel was closed for repairs and that you were able to walk through. So you could actually walk through these tunnels, recreating the Victorian experience. 2 tunnels, the train, note the arches, the keystone, the very Victorian architecture, and the trains still to this day. That's Wapping Station, standing on the platform or stepping off the platform, heading through the tunnel. If you go there today, above ground, there's a really, really interesting, I would actually recommend this to anyone who's interested in Brunel. This, where it says Brunel Museum on the, actually if I do this, I can point, can't I? Where it says Brunel, the Brunel Museum, was where the people entered to go down the steps to the when it was original pedestrian walk. Right. Now, getting on to the son. Isambard. So Isambard Brunel Jr., his first project was that he won a competition to build a bridge across the Avon River. If you've been to Bristol, the Avon River cuts this huge gorge through the town, really separating the 2 sides of the river. So they wanted to build a bridge, logical, across the thing. So Brunel wins the design. These structures on the edge, apparently his inspiration was Egyptian temples, to build those. So work starts on this in 1831, but the costs just blow out. It's never completed. By 1843, it's actually abandoned, and Brunel's career is a little bit shaky at this stage because people see that he's been involved in something that hasn't quite worked out. Then he's appointed chief engineer to the Great Western Railway, and this is really what makes him. He surveys the route between London and Bristol. He builds lots of bridges across valleys for the trains, tunnels. Note the architecture. He's got a very distinctive style, hasn't he? The same sort of bulky columns and lots of arches. This tunnel here at Box, really, really famous tunnel. It's 2 miles long, I think, and dead straight. He made it they started from both ends and they met exactly in the middle. Amazing engineering. This is finished in 1841. In that year, his father was knighted for his work on the tunnel and for other works that he done across the country. This is the terminus of the London to Bristol Railway, the Temple Meads Railway Station. The part that Brunel designed was this at the bottom, the black and white photo at the bottom there. Today, the trains don't come into that shed. Today, it's a car park, but you can actually go in and see it. You can still see the beautiful architecture. Where the trains come, if you take the train to Bristol, you do get off at a slightly more modern platform. Now, while he's busy working on the trains, Brunel also turns his attention to boats. He solved the problem of getting from London to Bristol quickly. He now wants to solve the problem of getting from Bristol to New York, and the sailing ships are at the mercy of the wind. He wants to try and come up with a steam-driven ship. The problem with steam-driven ships is you've got to carry coal, and the amount of coal you had to carry meant if you were going to New York, there was no room left for cargo. So Brunel reasons the solution has got to be bigger ships. but there's a limit to the length you can make wooden ships. So he starts looking at the idea of a metal hull. Now, this is ridiculed by a lot of people who think, well, metal sinks, metal won't float. But there was a precedent. Remember our old friend Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar? Nelson had, before the Battle of Trafalgar, had the bottom of his ship, the Victory, covered in copper plates. And he did that.
Got it turned off, Dale. It's on, but not. I've got.
You're not turned off because I can hear you. So his so Brunel, sorry, Nelson. So Nelson's part of his strategy for the Battle of Trafalgar was to outflank the French army, the French Navy. If you could make a ship sail faster and turn quicker, you had an advantage, because thinking about warfare in those days, you sail your ship towards the enemy, you turn 90 degrees and you fire your guns. And then you've got to get out of there quick, smart, before they fire their guns back and sink you. The thing that was slowing the ships down was all the barnacles on the hull. So Nelson came up with the idea of putting copper on the hull of his ship to stop the barnacles. People had thought his ship wouldn't sink. He had actually had to have a model made, and I think, is it George III? I'm getting my history muddled now. Whoever was king at the time had said, don't be ridiculous, don't be ridiculous. And they'd actually made a model of the Victory with copper on it and floated it in a bathtub to show the king that it would float. It's not the metal, it's the design, it's the shape. So anyway, so Brunel knows all this, and he puts his mind towards creating a metal ship. Now, the first one he does is this one. This is the Great Western. It's not the famous SS Great Britain. And notice it's still got a paddle. And this is a problem, because this actually slows you down, because it creates drag. It's on the side of the ship as you go through the water. It's not terribly efficient. What you want is a propeller at the back. And Brunel works all this out. Now, what have I done? Right. Okay. So now we're getting up to the famous Great Britain. And this is really what, well, I think is Brunel's greatest achievement. 1843, this is the launch of it, and it's a culmination. It's a metal hull, it's 100 metres long, it's steam driven, see the chimney in the middle? It's still got masts. Now originally it's got 6 masts. So, and it's got a propeller. So it's launched in 1843, great fanfare. Notice all the crowds. A lot of these people from Bristol that came out to watch the ship being launched, they'd watched it being built, this massive, massive ship in the middle of Bristol. A lot of them thought it was just going to sink, that there was no way this was going to float. They'd come down for the day to watch this, what was going to be a disaster, but it didn't. It came in. And Tony, you're going to love this. And Alan, this is a photo taken by Fox Talbot. So Fox Talbot, one of the very, very first photographers, captured this photograph shortly after she's slid down into the water. She was launched sideways, too long to launch straight along, sitting in the water at Bristol. Absolutely incredible photo. Right. This is one of her very earliest voyages. She sails several trips to America, which are economically not a great success. There's some bad management. She's plagued with a few problems. By 1852, notice this, they've reduced the number of masts and they've put an extra chimney? Do we call that a chimney? Funnel from the engines. There's another of her out in the sea. Right. This is where we come in. After really suffering a lot of financial losses, she's sold to a company that want to transport people to the Australian gold rushes. Huge demand for passenger ships. She's reconfigured. Notice now she's only got 3 masts. An extra deck is built with extra cabins because now she's going to carry people. So she's completely fitted out for carrying maximum number of passengers, and she's put on the Liverpool to Melbourne run. On her first voyage, she carries 630 passengers. Her first voyage in 1852, 630 passengers. Between 1852 and 1875, she makes 32 round trips to Australia. 15,000 immigrants arrived in Australia on the SS Great Britain. 2% of people who live in Australia today are descended from passengers on the SS Great Britain. Maybe some of you are. Right. This painting was done of her on the Australian trip. Notice now there's only 1 funnel. They keep jiggling it, but there's still the 3 sails. And of course, if the winds are fair, you put up the sail, but she's an auxiliary steamer. Right. She's become so famous that when the British cricket team comes to Australia in 1861, they insist that they are taken on the SS Great Britain. And apparently they were doing practices and things on the deck, as you could imagine. This is really interesting. In 1864, a passenger to Melbourne wrote down the names of all, in his diary, lists all the animals that are on the boat as they leave. Now remember, this is the 1850s, there's no refrigeration. So sailing ships carried livestock. Most ships carried a cow or a goat for milk. And if you wanted animals to eat on the voyage, you had to take them. So the SS Great Britain had a cow, not to be eaten, she's for milk. 3 bullocks, they're going to be eaten. 150 sheep, also destined for the kitchen. 30 pigs, 500 chickens, 400 ducks, 100 geese and 50 turkeys. And of course, somewhere on the ship, you've got to have enough hay, root vegetables, cattle cake, grain and dried peas to feed the animals before you eat them. So this is a massive task. Now, I want to go now into a little bit of the story of the SS Great Britain and why, in some ways, she's still so famous. After she finishes taking passengers to Australia, she has a couple of other reincarnations. She ends up in the Falklands carrying coal, a rather lacklustre end to her career. She was finally scuttled just off the Falkland Islands and left. So this photo of her shows her, she'd been stripped. People used to head out and take anything of value off the ship. And she was just rotting away. A group of people in the 1960s in Bristol came up with the idea of bringing her back, saving what was left, getting her from the Falkland Islands back to Bristol and restoring her. So this became a massive task, absolutely massive task. This iron hull had been sitting there, rusting and corroding for what, nearly 100 years? So the first thing is, how do you get it? It's sitting, in this photo here, it's sitting on sand, so it's beached. How do you get it afloat when it's full of holes? So what they actually did, I've gone the wrong way, sorry everybody. In the top slide there, they built like a giant raft, a huge pontoon, put her up on the pontoon, they have to really, really carefully watch the weather because they've got to tow this across the Atlantic. So they managed to do that, get it through fair weather. Then when they get to the Avon River, the pontoon won't fit. So they have to manage to tug her along the thing. And they actually sort of padded like inflatable lilos and things to try and cover all the holes on the inside as they towed it up. So all the time they're worried that she's going to sink. At one point, they had to widen one of the locks that had been built across the Avon since she'd been launched. So she was built, we saw up on the Avon River, launched, but since then the river has become narrow by the lock. So they had to pull that down, they get her along, and massive crowds, incredible crowds. And these are some pictures from the 1970s towing what's just a rusty old hull. Look at this lovely picture here. She's going, can you see? She's actually going under Brunel's bridge down the Avon. Now, this is what she looks like now. I brought her back to her original docks, and you can imagine the work that has gone into turning that rusty hulk into this. So there she is, sitting in her dock. All her gilding has been restored. She's been painted. The decking up the top has all been put back. This is what she looks like from the front. Now, she's been turned into a museum, so you can see there's a gangway across there, so you can buy your ticket in that shed and you can walk across and go inside. You can also walk where I am here at ground level. Now, see how she looks like she's sitting in the ocean? Well, it's an optical illusion. She's not really sitting in the ocean. She's sitting in a couple of inches of water over this sort of, I don't know what it would be, clear something, and you can actually walk underneath and inspect the underneath of it. And what's really interesting is this underneath metal part, they haven't done a lot of restoration to. They've left it so you can see what it was like. These giant silver things down here are dehumidifiers. So they're removing 80% of the moisture. This area is sealed and they're trying to keep this as dry as possible. So this you can see, can you see the holes? These massive holes that are in the hull from the corrosion. So these were the holes that all had to be sort of covered over. She was coming along. You can see the dehumidifiers here really well. You can get a bit of an idea of the size of the boat by the people that are sitting there looking up. She's absolutely huge. When you walk along underneath it, you get a real sense of the grandeur and the size of this boat. Here's the massive propeller. And this was one of Brunel's strokes of genius. He didn't invent the propeller. There were smaller boats that had been using propellers, but he's the first person to put it on an ocean-going ship and to see the potential of it. The propeller was actually altered during the course of the life of the SS Great Britain. When Brunel put it, it was a rigid propeller that sat there all the time with an axle going through to the engines. Later, it was put on some sort of a hoist lifting thing, so it could be lifted up out of the water if they weren't using it to reduce drag as it going through the water. These are some of the massive engines that are powering this boat, and of course there's coal and things. This is the deck. You can see funnel there and the structures on the deck. You'll love this one. Look at this. You did not mingle with people beyond your own class. First class passengers were strictly kept to, now is it the front or the back? I think it's the front of the boat. It might be the back. The second, third and the steerage passengers were not allowed. And there's actually a white line painted on the deck and the sign, just to make sure. The deck, here we've got Pal, who's providing milk for everybody. One of the pigs in a sort of a stable, really, built up on the deck. This is the first class dining room. China, silver service, candelabras, beautiful lamps, a lot of gilding, velvet chairs, beautiful carpet, beautifully ornate. Look at the chairs. Can you see here on the chairs a bit of a slot? The back of the chair flips so that you can either sit facing this way or you can flip it and face it that way. This meant of an evening they could remove the tables and they could put the chairs around the side for when they were having a ball. And there was a lot of entertainment for first class passengers. There were concerts, there was newspapers produced on board. You know, there was really quite pleasant if you were sailing first class. This is your first class cabin. There's a lady with a little boy and there's a couple of toys here that we're all really familiar with. She's got an ensuite. She's got a bath. She's got a hand basin. There's looking down into the top of the basin. So quite comfortable accommodation. One of the many galleys on board. There's quite a few of these as you explore the ship. Some of them are just for first class passengers. Some are for the second, third class passengers. And they've set them out really well. They've got reproduction food, and up in the first class galleys there's meat and chops and things, whereas down in the second and third you've got bread and, you know, things. Here we've got another close-up of the cabin. This is a second class cabin, so it's nearly as good as the first one. It's got a writing desk. This one was set up for single men. That they had a couple of pretending that there were single men staying in that one. The bathroom, I've shown you that one. This is the water closet, the toilet, which really for those days is not too bad. This is in the first class section of the ship, of course. So they have the toilet there. This is second class, so now you've got more people sharing, but still not too bad. You know, you've got your own bunk. There's a curtain across the entrance, so you've got a little bit of privacy, and you've only sharing with 4 people. This is steerage though. So we're now down below decks. There's no portholes down here. Very, very crowded. You had to do your own washing, of course. Everybody was allowed one trunk with their belongings to take with them and another trunk that was stored elsewhere on the ship. The trunk you had with you, somewhere on it you had to write wanted. When you're wandering around antique shops, take note, anytime you see any old trunks, especially these old tin ones, if they have the word wanted written on them, that's a sure sign that that trunk came on a sailing ship and had the belongings of the person, the clothes, their spare food, their cutlery that they wanted on the voyage. This is where the steerage passengers are eating. So compared to your first class passengers, it's not quite as elegant, but look, it's not too bad. No, not too bad. Ropes across the table in case there's a storm. All through the boat, one thing they've done, I think, really, really well is trying to make this, well, it's a museum really, this exhibit, look like it would have, is that it's crowded with produce. Every square inch of the boat down below decks has got what would have been food for the voyage, just packed in. There's a room here that actually has carcasses of freshly killed animals. It's not a fridge, of course, but they wouldn't have been killed too long ago, I wouldn't think. Right. After the SS Great Britain, Brunel went on to the Great Eastern. Now, the Great Eastern was an even bigger ship. So he's got this idea of going bigger and bigger and bigger. He actually goes back to his idea of a propeller on this one. He's got 4 funnels. This ship was built in London, in the dockyards, down towards Greenwich. If you're walking along the Thames path and you walk down towards Greenwich, you actually pass the site of where this was built. It's now trendy apartment, sort of inner city area, living area, but they have turned the launching area of this ship into a bit of a park with a bit of a plaque and a bit of a story of Brunel. This is part of laying of the Great Eastern. And look at this is a really, really interesting photo. 1854. This is 1854. Think what's going on in Ballarat. I mean, people in Ballarat, some of them are still living in tents. They're building this absolutely incredible ship. Look at the chains. This is going to be the anchor chains. As at Sovereign Hill, you can spot the bosses from the workers by their hats. The taller your hat, the richer you are. So the bosses have the top hats, and of course the workers. And here is the famous photo. And this was taken here. So this photo was taken in front of these chains here. And there he is, just before the Great Eastern is launched. One thing that I love about this photo is that he's actually got mud all over his trousers. If you look at the bottom of his trousers there, where the buttons are, they're all, and his boots, they're splattered in mud. Brunel was quite a hands-on engineer. He was always down where the men were working. He was always in the thick of it. He was crawling through tunnels. While the Great Eastern is being built, he has a very bad fall, falls down into one of the holds, and they think he's not going to survive. He does, but not for terribly long. He was never in the best of health, whether it was the smoking or a workaholic, often wet, conditions he was living in, so maybe that didn't help. So this photo is really only a couple of years before he dies. So Great Eastern launched in 1858 and financially doesn't make any money. The owners made a big mistake with this ship. They targeted the luxury market. They had the cabins fitted out with too many first-class cabins. They tried to make it like a floating luxury hotel, I guess like modern cruise liners, whereas the big market was your middle-class immigrants moving to Australia or America, and they really missed their mark. There weren't a lot of super rich people wanting to sail around the ocean. I wonder why. Right. Now, go back to Bristol, right back to the beginning. Remember I told you this bridge was abandoned because of cost overruns? In 1859, Brunel died. So he suffered a stroke and he just never recovered. He was really well known by then, quite famous, and the sort of company of engineers launched a campaign to finish this bridge as a monument. They were able, there had been a suspension bridge built somewhere else. They had these big chains. They were able to acquire these from another bridge. And so they were able to finish this. And they finished it and sort of opened it in 1865 as a tribute to Brunel. And it really is. It's become the icon of Bristol. You can see it from, almost the whole town. That's an exaggeration, but you can see it from a lot of places. A lot of Bristol uses it on a lot of their tourism advertising you see it on T-shirts and jumpers. It's become a real icon of the city. You can see how high it is over the gorge. I have actually seen people jumping with parachutes off here. You know, it's really, really high bridge. You can walk across it. It's a bit scary, but there's a walking track. This photo, of course, shows the bridge and towing the SS Great Britain home in 1970. So there she is, being towed up the Avon, coming home to be restored under Brunel's bridge. So we've got Brunel's bridge and Brunel's boat, which is a really fitting tribute to the great man. This is added to the bridge, and this is really saying that this bridge is his iconic bridge. Construction began in 1836 when Melbourne is 1 year old. So putting it in perspective for us. Stops in 1943 through lack of funds, and 5 years, and it's not until 1964, 5 years after his death, that the bridge was completed as a monument to his fame. The chains used were those from the Hungerford Bridge, there we go, that had been taken down, designed and erected by him. So he had designed the Hungerford Bridge, but when it was taken down, they reused the chains to make this. And that's the end of my little story of Brunel. Thank you, everybody.